Welcome in Pakhuis de Zwijger. My name is Servas, and this is a very special edition of Designing Cities for All. And we are going to talk about a quite interesting book, Designing Disorder. How can you design disorder? Is this even possible? This book is, of course, has been written by Pablo Sendra, and he is here in the venue today. And he co-authored this with Richard Sennert. And he, of course, was the author of The Uses of Disorder that came out. This book came out in 1970s. Now, 15 years later, the same ideas of trying to create disorder in cities and making sure that, or getting to the point that a flawed and ordered city, or the ordered and structured city, is a flawed city, and gives too little room for creativity or other things that would happen normally, is still quite a important topic to talk about. Well, during this special hour of Designing Cities for All, of course, we're going to talk about all these kind of questions. Afterwards, there is a little Q&A with the people who are in the audience today here in Pakhuis de Zwijger. If you want to join us next time, feel free to join us. Come over at dezwijger.nl. You see all information about the other programs within Designing Cities for All, but also the other programs here in Pakhuis. All of these programs are, of course, free of charge. If you want to support us, please do. It's completely free, but via the QR code that will be on the screen in a bit, you are able to sponsor us a bit and to make sure that we can make these kind of programming. Let's start with the event itself. Of course, already mentioned Pablo Sendra. He is here today. But also with us today is Liongo Juliana, and you are an architect, and you are the director of the Liongo Architecture. And also with us is Shai Revif, and you're a social designer and a design researcher, and you're especially connected to the curator of the Embassy of Inclusive Society and co-founder of De Voorkamer. Pablo, thank you for joining us today. You prepared a presentation on your book and why talking about this is so important. I talked quite a lot, I guess, so it's up to you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So as you were saying, this book is kind of like a continuation or an interpretation of a book that took place 50 years ago. It was The Uses of Disorder, that was written by Richard Sennett when he was only 25 years old in 1970. And 50 years later, a lot of these ideas are still very relevant. So I read the Uses of Disorder when I was the same age as Richard Sennett when he wrote it. I was 25 years old. I was a student at the Bartlett School of Architecture in London. And for me, reading the book had a strong impact, both in my professional life and thinking as an architect, as an urban designer, and also in my personal life as a young person that was kind of like finding its own identity through life, because this is a lot of the things that the book talk about. Can I see the slides? Yeah, sorry. So this is the Bartlett. This was the Bartlett in 2018, which is the architecture school what I studied when I was reading Richard Sennett's book. That, as I said, it was authored in 1970, and what the book said is that there are certain kinds of disorder in city life that are very positive for city life because they enable social interactions, social encounters, contact between people, and they allow people to transition from to what Richard Sennett called an adult identity, an identity where people are comfortable with the presence of strangers and that can even interact with the strangers in the public space. What Richard Sennett was saying in 1970 is that cities were starting to have too much order, particularly in the context of modernist architecture and modernist urban planning, that all this order that was being imposed in cities was eliminating the possibilities of having of social contact, of social interaction, and was also making people have fear of a stranger, so see the strangers as something threatening rather than as something positive. So many years later, many decades later, when I read the book, I saw that actually cities, since the book was written in 1970, have tend to impose even more order through urban planning. And I also saw a lot of parallel ideas between the situation in the 1960s, in the late 60s, when Richard Sennett wrote the book, and in the 2010s. Particularly in the early 2010s, it was around the social movements. If we think about the May 1968, which happened more or less at the time when Richard Sennett wrote the book, and also the 15M movement in Spain in 2011, and then the Occupy movement in the US and the UK, the Arab Spring, a lot of the social movements that were taking place in the beginning of 2000s as a response to austerity and as a result of kind of like the power response to the economic crisis, had a lot of parallel ideas with what was happening in the late 60s. And then also in terms of urban planning, they imposed orders that happened in the late 60s, that was mainly through modernist architecture, modernist planning. There were also other kind of orders being imposed in the city in the 2010s, quite different from the ones that were imposed in the late 60s, because in the late 60s, most of the orders imposed in the city were around urban highways crossing the city, were about large housing estates, were mainly built by the state, so they were mainly publicly funded. Whereas now the kind of order imposed in the city is mainly driven by the global financial economy, by real estate speculation. But there's still a lot of parallels between the order imposed in both periods. So at the beginning of the book, I do a bit of reflection comparing two places where there was a strong activism in the late 60s and also in the 2010s, which is the Westway in the neighborhood of North Kensington in London. This is just to locate, for those of you that do not know London very well, it's located where Portobello Market is, that is world famously known. And the Westway was it's still an urban motorway that was built in the late 60s. And when it was built, one of the responses from the community, the construction destroyed around 5,000 homes, the construction of the motorway, and the response of the community was to start using the space below the motorway while it was being built as adventure playgrounds, as self-built adventure playgrounds, as a response to that kind of like imposed order, which is those that you can see in the picture. And that led to then the residents, the communities in the area claiming the land for community ownership in compensation of the damage that the motorway had done. And it became one of the largest community land trusts in the country. It's a 23-acre large community land trust, mainly for community spaces. But then 50 years later, or nearly 50 years later, a lot of community activists started to contest kind of like the administration at that time of the community land trust, because it's starting to commodify all the spaces that used to be community spaces were starting to be used mainly for commercial purpose, losing the original purpose of the community land trust. So a lot of activism came, and then when the Grenfell Tower, which is in the area, when there was a fire in the tower where 72 people died, and then the communities starting to use one of the spaces below the flyover below the motorway as a space for storing donations, and also for starting a process of healing with the community from the ground up as well. So there was kind of like there's been interesting responses in terms of activism in both places, and you can see how almost in the same spot in the slide happened these adventure playgrounds, and then this is space for healing after the Grenfell Tower tragedy. But how do we take these very located and small interventions, these small contestations to power, from the local and neighborhood scale to the metropolitan scale. This is a question that normally Richard Sen and I get asked when we present the book, and one of the answers that we give in the book is this idea of that we don't propose that these interventions, these contestations to the imposed order should be scaled up. We propose that this should be networked. They should work independently, a bit kind of like from inspiration from the anarchist ideas, being kind of like independent from each other, having their own processes of decision making, but at the same time be connected and exchange knowledge. And then we also propose that in coordination with these networks, bottom-up initiatives, there should be some open municipal institutions that ensure that everyone, that no one's left behind, and that everyone has basic access to kind of like a lot of services. So we see on this interaction between networked grassroots initiatives and open municipal institutions that support those that have more difficult to access certain services. And on those interactions, we see how cities can become much more open. So just to clarify, because the title of the book is quite provocative, this idea of designing disorder, can we actually design something that informality, disorder, the unexpected, the disorder that Richard Sen explained in the uses of disorder? And I think it's important to clarify that by designing disorder, we don't mean disordered forms like it happened with postmodern architecture, where the reaction to modernism was just kind of like more, let's say, weird shapes in opposition to the modernist less is more. We propose something quite different. We propose building for uncertainty, building for the unplanned, and how to create conditions for the unplanned through urban design. So this is what we propose, and we also propose contesting the imposed orders. And this idea of creating the conditions for the appliance through creating a kind of urban design that is flexible, adaptable, and open-ended. This is the approach of the book to designing disorder. This idea of infrastructures for disorder, which are initial urban design interventions that create conditions for the unplanned use of the public realm, and which are a point of departure for a continuous and open process. And so the book starts from the infrastructure, the pipes and the electricity and the water and the things that go below ground, but understand this idea of infrastructure not just as a physical infrastructure, but also as a social infrastructure of that enable, which are physical spaces, organizations, and also pieces of physical infrastructure that enable connection between people. So we divided this part of the book on 4 parts, which is below, which is what is below ground, above, disorder in section, and then process and flux, with the idea of trying almost to replicate the kind of drawings you were doing in architectural urban project, and also thinking and reflecting through the process and the changing nature of it throughout. So also before going forward, the book also builds on this idea that Richard Sen presented in his earlier works of the open city, a city that is adaptable, in opposition to this idea to the closed city, which is a city that is very rigid and doesn't have the capacity to evolve. Just and I'm gonna go just to keep the presentation shorter. I'm just gonna try to go quickly through some of the proposals that we go, and then we can probably discuss this a bit more in the debate. But basically, in below ground, what we think is what kind of infrastructure we can propose that is collective and that is open and flexible, so we can start provoking social interactions, social connections through the infrastructure. So we propose, as the subtitle of the book explains, we propose a series of disruptions in the public space. So almost thinking about what happens if suddenly in the public space you propose a kind of infrastructure that needs to be shared by people that are there? What kind of negotiations start taking place? So this is the kind of situations that we start imagining, also building on some of the examples, so some of the experiences, such as, for example, the initiatives called Repowering that have been taking place in London and in other places in the UK, which are about creating energy cooperatives in some of the social housing estates, and seeing how through these energy cooperatives new relationships start taking place, because suddenly people are sharing a piece of infrastructure, suddenly there's certain surplus that come from it that is used for community projects and so on, and what kind of relationships start emerging from this supply of a physical infrastructure that becomes at the end a social infrastructure. But I'm just going to give also an example to go a bit of that. An example that relates to this idea of below, but also to the following of above that I'm going to explain in a few minutes. And the idea departs from understanding the infrastructure as an assemblage, not as a finished product, but as a composition of many different elements. Some are material, some are non-material, some are human, some are not human, that interact and create this kind of like emergence of unplanned activities. And I'm going to use an example that I've used in various occasions and that we discuss in the book, which is Gillette Square. Gillette Square is a small public space in Dalston, which is in the London Borough of Hackney in East London. And Gillette Square, this is an image of Gillette Square, I think from 2012, 2013. And but Gillette Square wasn't always a square. It used to be a car park. So this space that you see there as a square, it used to be a car park, and the building that is on the back, it was kind of like very derelicted. And one of the first actions that took place, it was placing those kiosks that you see there in the picture that are currently used. So a kind of like a truck. There's a few pictures of them. You can search online. There's a picture of a few trucks building this, bringing this little pots from the factory and placing them in the public space. And then when they were placed in the public space, they were rented at a very affordable rent. So the community, there was kind of like mainly the Afro-Caribbean community, started to have their own businesses in the space, a cafe, kind of like a radio, different kind of like businesses that wouldn't be affordable to have on the high street. And these businesses started to create certain social interaction around them. So suddenly in the car park, you had this kiosk, and then people were just gathering in the car park around the kiosks. So they almost created the necessity of a square before it came. And then the square was built. And this is kind of like some other pictures of the square. I think this is probably from 2014, I guess. And then a few years later, after the square was built, another collective of architects that is called MAF Architecture Art came, and they put 2 shipping containers like that in this square. And they filled the shipping containers with different elements, such as the table tennis that you've seen before, those table tennis, those market stalls, also a screen and AV material for an outdoor cinema. So suddenly the square also play space for children, skateboarding ramps for skaters, different kind of props and elements, which means that the square is continuously transformed. Every time you go to the square, you see a completely different situation, because they have these elements that volunteers get in and out of the containers, and that continuously transform the square, and the square where everyone from different cultural backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds meet and share a space. So this idea of different elements that different elements that include kind of like affordable rent, rearranging an existing space that was very rigid, such as a car park, and then also having the capacity to have elements in the public space that can be moved and can continuously transform the space. This is what creates this idea of the public space as an open system, this idea of the open city, and created a series of infrastructures, of physical infrastructures that generate this social interaction. which responds a lot to this idea of also of that we explain in the above chapter of creating these new arrangements in the public space, such as the kiosk that were these new arrangements, equipping the public space with different infrastructures, different materialities as well in the pavement, and also creating these public spaces as a system that can in a certain modular way be transformed. Then the book also discusses how to transform the public space in the section, how to induce these disorders through the section, through the urban landscape itself, and also through how to transform particularly looking, for example, at the idea of the social housing estates that had basically some different kind of like tower blocks and buildings scattered around the landscape, how to transform the landscape in between to create these possibilities for social interaction. And finally, this chapter of process and flux kind of like wraps up some of these ideas on what is the process of implementing some of these interventions that we talk about in the book. And we talk about looking at the existing social infrastructure. One of the examples that we discuss in the book is this Granville Community Kitchen, which is a grassroots organization that I've been collaborating with in London, that they organize every Friday a community dinner in their community space. They also have a community garden, which is the one that you see in the picture, where they grow food and vegetables, and anyone can come at any time and pick what they want. So it's self-managed and people just pick whatever they want. And then during the pandemic, they became mainly the main source of food for a lot of families at risk, because they were delivering food to their doors and so on, free food. So they are in a space right now that is about to be redeveloped, and that will reduce the community space. We've done a project with them, and we've calculated that will reduce the community space by 72%, which will put a lot of this situation at risk. And one of the issues is because the process of urban planning doesn't look at what is the existing social infrastructure and doesn't value these kinds of initiatives. So one of the key steps that we discuss in the book is looking at existing social infrastructure and seeing how to enhance them through the process. And then another thing that we discuss in this process and flux is how to design for uncertainty, how to create how to work with local authorities and be able to convince them that uncertainty is something very positive. I'm just gonna go run through. This is a video that I'll leave the YouTube link here so you can watch it. But basically, the video is which is online. It's it's a clip of the discussion that is on the late part of the book. On the late part of the book, there's making and unmaking. And here is a part where Richard Sennett and I don't fully agree, probably. It's one of the few parts where we discuss kind of like different views, because the editor, Leo Hollis, asked both of us that whether the role of the architect is more or less political. And Richard Sennett says that well, you'll see the video, but basically he sees that the architect and the planner has certain political limitations in their role, whereas I discuss some of the projects that have been involved, and I say that it actually depends. It depends on your relationship with the community, on who hires you, and so on. You have the situations such as the project that I did for example, a co-design project that I facilitated in the London Borough of Wimbledon. London Borough of Merton, Wimbledon, in the London Borough of Merton, where I was hired by a local authority to facilitate a co-design process with the community, so act as a mediator, which is what Richard Sennett says. Whereas there are other projects that I've been involved with, such as, let me just go quickly through this, such as these two people's plans and community plans, where I've been where residents that are facing the demolition of their social housing estate, they come to me for help. And I've been through my research, I run co-design workshop with them, and I co-produce with them alternative plans for the demolitions of their homes. So then after this process, the residents have created their own plan with the support of my team, of course, but they've created their own plan that they're very proud of, and that is evidence-based, also through a social impact assessment, through assessing also the environmental impact and a financial viability study and so on. So different kind of like evidence-based documents that they can go and present to the local authority and say, here, there is an alternative option. So what I discuss also in this last part of the book with Richard Sennett is that actually the architect can have a political role that, of course, has a lot of limitations, as Richard Sennett says, because at the end it's politicians who made a lot of these decisions, but that can support some of the activist work through the knowledge and the experience that an architect or an urban planner has for this. So I think I'm going to leave this here have a bit more room for discussion.
Thank you. Pablo, Sandra, please join us here on the table. And for the people at home, of course, this is part of Designing Cities for All, which is a 2-year-long program we from Pakhuizen Zwijger organized together with the Creative Industry Funds of the Netherlands. Liongo, Juliana, of course, was the first fellow in this long series. So if you want to look all the dialogues and discussions we had with him on how to design creative and public space in such a way, or cities in such a way that it's inclusive and connects everyone with the city, please look at zwijger.nl for more information. And of course, also with Shai, you are connected with, you contributed to the 18 perspectives on Designing Cities for All. So also there are a lot of opportunities to connect with that as well. And Pablo, you are an architect and urban designer, but you're also associate professor at the Bartlett School of Planning.
Yes.
So we have all the little things there. How was it writing a book with Richard Sennett?
It was a great experience. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Yeah. So people are normally curious about how that happened. So maybe I can tell a bit about this story. So basically, I was as I said, I read the book while I was a master's student, but I didn't know Richard at that time, and he was never my supervisor, as some people think sometimes. Well, then I continued some of the work that I did in my master's on my PhD, and I was as part of my PhD, I was spending a few months in Cambridge with Ash Amin, and he introduced me to Richard Sennett, and from that we started kind of like the conversation that led to doing this book.
Was it your idea, or was it like a collaboration that you wanted to have like a redo or maybe an update?
Well, a lot of the work that is on the book builds on some of the ideas from my PhD. This idea of, my PhD was titled Infrastructure for Disorder, which is a part of the same title of one part of the book. But it was when I moved back to London at the end of 2014. I had Richard and I met, catch up again after some time, and he was the one that proposed me doing a book together. So, and I was very happy about that.
Amazing.
And then it was great. It was a process of meeting regularly for a few months. It was written in a relatively short period of time, in less than a year. And we were meeting regularly, normally in his house, and just having chats about the chapters that we had written. And yeah.
Liongo, Shai, what are your first response?
I have a follow-up question.
Please do. Go ahead.
I was wondering to the role of youth in disorder, because you started by speaking about the age of Richard Sennett when he wrote it, and speaking about your age when you read it. But in one of the quotes we saw in the beginning, Richard says that the city of disorder can help us move to adulthood. And I find it an interesting tension between disorder that I connect very much to youth, anarchist youth, the writing of a book as a young and the reading I was wondering if you could elaborate.
Yeah, so in the uses of disorder, what Richard Sennett says is that during adolescence, so teenagers build kind of like a purified identity. In the search for their own identity, they build a purified identity of themselves. So they associate themselves with a particular group, a particular culture, a subculture, in a process of searching their own identity. And that's fine when it's in adolescence, let's say. But then the problem that he identifies in the book is how for some people, this problem persists in adulthood, that they start kind of like secluding themselves from the world by identifying, let's say, enclosing themselves into a predefined, purified identity, as he said. And sometimes that even jumps into kind of like a community identity, this idea of the purified community that he discusses in the book. So this idea of the adult identity, it means more liberating yourself from that enclosed and defined identity to have a much more flexible and fluid identity.
Younger?
Well, the first question that came to mind for me was, have you experienced disorder? And have you been able to enjoy disorder? And was that the trigger for...
So I think, as I said, for me, I read the book when I was 25. I was living in London in a city that was new to me because I had just moved as a student, and it was this process of discovering places and discovering also that the idea of the idea of the perfect city that I had been taught previously in schools of architecture and these kind of like principles, that they were meaningless and too universal, and it was more about certain urban situations that included the physical space, but also included many other things that the end created what an exciting city is, right? It's not just about certain certain principles to follow to create an exciting city. There's much more than that.
Mm-hmm. Within the project of Designing Cities for All, we work from a premise of that everything is designed. So a pen is designed, a tablet is designed, everything is designed. And if you design something with an outcome in mind, or like cognizant of the outcome, you can have a positive outcome. But if you don't, there will still be a biased outcome. So it's almost impossible to not be biased in your design. How can you make sure that with a disordered city, you don't have negative effects, or you can still have this just an inclusive city?
So that's why we propose this idea of networks and institutions, because we believe that. So we believe on some kind of anarchic system for the city that is open, that comes from the bottom up. But we also think that it's still the role of the state and the role of the municipality to ensure that no one's left behind and the cities are inclusive and they cater for everyone. And if we think the city as a network of different people that are associated to different initiatives, you need to make sure that those that are not associated to the initiatives are also catered for. So that's the role also of public institution, learning from what is on the ground, but also ensuring that everyone is included. That's also why we don't propose leave everything to happen. And what we say in the book is that it's exactly that, is that we need to design for disorder. Yeah. If we leave things, so the way cities have evolved, particularly after kind of like modernism and also with neoliberal urban planning and financialized urban planning, is that things tend to be more rigid. Yeah. So if you leave things, let's say, non-design, they'll tend to be more rigid. So what we say is actually that we need to design for breaking that rigidity.
So would it mean we want to be too effective in our design, and therefore we remove every excess, and you have to create more room for like playing around or things that happen per chance? Is that?
So it's both of that. Yeah. Is designing in a way that leaves more room and more flexibility for unpredictable activities to take place. But for that, you need to create the conditions for activities to take place. You need to create certain physical and social infrastructure for it to happen.
Leonga, you are an architect both here in the Netherlands but also in the Caribbean. How does this play in your work? Do you connect disorder? Is that something that you try to introduce in your designs? Or
yes, I wrote down, I think, design for disorder or designing disorder. You mean there's a difference in that? If you design for disorder, that means, I think it means, to me it means leaving space for the unpredictable. And maybe my first question was not clear, but growing up in Curacao, I have seen that in a disorderly, maybe something that looks disorderly in the beginning, some kind of something very positive can initiate. And let's say if you leave space for people to discover and create by themselves instead of dictating it in advance, you get things that you could not predict yourself as a professional. And I think what happens, I mean, if we bring that to the Netherlands, what I experience in the Netherlands is that a lot of people in the Netherlands have never experienced disorder. To be able to value disorder and that from disorder something very positive can be initiated. And that makes it really difficult if you have been always been valued for the way you were able to organize and predict and take away everything that's unpredictable, that is the best you can do. I mean, look at the level of insurance Dutch people have. So I think that step, and that was my first question, have you experienced disorder? And I think that is very important to be able to value what happens if you leave space for disorder. Sorry, that was maybe kind of long, but...
Yeah, for the people who are not known with the Netherlands, this country is, the Germans are known for the Deutsche Gründlichkeit, but we Dutch can do something as well. So I know the feeling. But how do you respond to that? Do you think do we need to experience disorder more to be able to truly value it?
But definitely. I think that's exactly what the uses of disorder originally was saying, and this is what we've tried to take into urban design. So basically, and I think what Richard Sennett said in 1970 is that the way the city had evolved have deprived people from experiencing disorder, and now when people experience disorder, they feel not at ease. So people have become fearless of any. So they have fear now to any unexpected situation or encounters that they're not expecting, and so on. So the idea is how to build a city that facilitates those encounters and facilitates and create those unexpected experiences.
How does Shai, with your research, how does disorder come to the forefront in your research? Is it something that is a topic that comes back quite a lot?
So I was thinking about a few things. I was thinking about sort of this relation to the body and the bodily experience in the city. And I think you touched a little bit upon that, but on one hand I had to think from the inclusive perspective framework, order can help ensure that different people can use the public space based on their different needs. So, take all the different landscape tangible solutions that we have for people who need to see the city or to feel the city in a different way to navigate it. So in that sense, like the order could bridge disorders. But on the other hand, the ability to play and to bring the body into the city, for that, I think the disorder is playing like a really important role. And I was curious, in many of the examples, there were examples of play, of game, of the body in the city. Is that a concept that you see as interlaced with the disorder?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I remember that one of the projects that I did, it was back in 2018-19, so it was kind of like coincided when we were writing the book. It was a participation process in the public space. What we did is kind of like encourage people to participate and to encounter and to start kind of like discussing among each other what they wanted in the public space through play. So it was in Wimbledon. It was called Play Wimbledon, and what we did, it was kind of like building temporary installations in the public space. And they were almost like temporary playgrounds in the public space, but they had both playgrounds and spaces to. There was one image on the slides of that, and spaces to sit, where people at the end kind of like. We created kind of like spaces for discussions about how people wanted the public space to be. And I was thinking, while doing this, kind of actually this idea of play is kind of like almost like a Trojan horse for introducing this idea of disorder into the city, because it's very difficult also to talk about to tell to public authorities, I'm going to introduce more disorder in your street, and they would be able to kind of like, maybe not.
Yeah, it's like the positive of disorder would be the play.
So sometimes you need to kind of like say, okay, how do we unpack this idea of disorder? And definitely play and improvisation and this idea of the performance of the body in the street is definitely part of it. Yeah.
But it's so interesting because it goes back to youth and that tension between youth and adulthood, and it's. For kids or for youth, it's kind of more easy to create spaces for play because kids play or later on skate and that sort of thing. What would be spaces for play or for disorder for adults, elderly, where the body is a bit,
But I think it's about I think a lot can be done through design. It's about creating spaces that facilitate that kind of encounter spaces where people can sit and discuss and also creating. I mean, a lot of the things that we speak about in the book is what kind of infrastructure can you create for enabling different kind of interactions that can be playful? Is it about providing electricity? Is it about providing water? Is it about providing, I don't know, like in Gillette Square, that they provided AV material or table tennis? At the end, all of these things are also for adult play as well.
Exactly, yeah.
So, but if you look at a city like London, which is from an Amsterdam perspective, a very chaotic city, because it's not planned. Amsterdam has been planned since the 1600s and quite rigidly. And London, well, of course there is some planning, but mostly it's no planning, it just happened.
Yeah.
How would you look, and you wrote it mostly about London.
Yes.
So how would you look from the perspective of this book at a city like Amsterdam, where everything is structured, with even the canals, it's like a 16th century grid? Yeah.
But I guess you need to, so more than just introducing disorder per se, I think you need to look about which are the rigid elements of the planning of the city, in this case, Amsterdam, that are preventing people from interacting from each other, from talking to each other. So what are the elements that are preventing also the city for keep changing and evolving?
So it's more about barriers and less about structures on the map itself.
Exactly. If you think, for example, if you think about a city like Barcelona, which has like a completely planned grid, that doesn't mean there is a very ordered city. There's a lot of things that have taken place in Barcelona that respond to this idea of disorder. So it's important not to misunderstand this idea of a rigid, let's say, an urban grid. Doesn't necessarily mean that the city is going to be more ordered. Actually, the Cerdà grid in Barcelona has allowed also the city to grow in a sort of organic way, in a certain way. Yeah.
So would you say that cities like Barcelona or Amsterdam are more creative, less rigid than London is?
I wouldn't know about Amsterdam.
Yeah, or
probably.
Barcelona.
And I think it's very difficult to generalize it with such a big metropolis as London. I think probably. I think it's very difficult to compare London and Barcelona, to be honest.
Oh, sure it is. Xiao was talking about because we walk around to the city at this moment, there's a big discussion here in Amsterdam about so-called autoluw. So the restructuring of the whole city and take cars out of it, take a lot of parking space out of it, to create space for playing children, but also for climate adaptiveness of the city. And this brings rules on how you can interact with public space because people need to go through there. How would you advise like these kinds of cities to talk about these kind of rules? So what you said, you can park your bike wherever you want, but if you do, people in a wheelchair or you have to use a wheelchair, or people with a buggy can't go through, and you want them to go through. So how do you balance those two ideas without being like suffocating?
No, that's a very difficult question, and I guess you need to ensure that it's going a bit back to the network and municipalism discussion. You need to ensure that people have freedom to create their own initiatives, and you support this grassroots initiative. At the end, you also ensure that no one is left behind. So you have to ensure that there is always a minimum for wheelchair access and stuff like that. But to a certain extent, if you design cities in a very flexible way, there's always going to be space for wheelchairs. I'm just thinking now, just to go back to Barcelona, for example, about the Superblock initiative that they've done there, that I think is quite different from any other traffic reduction initiative that has done elsewhere, because normally other traffic reduction, like for example the London one, which is the low traffic neighborhoods, I very much focus on changing mobility modes, where there was in Barcelona. It's about how people interact in the public space, free sitting, all in the same surface, and a space for social interaction in the super blocks that they've built in the newer ones. There are many possibilities for a wheelchair to walk through. It has multiple paths, not just one. So you would have to you have to fill everything with bikes, basically, for not allowing a wheelchair to go through.
How do you? Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Shai.
I was wondering how you look at this, because in well, at least in the Amsterdam perspective, but I'm pretty sure it's also in Frankfurt, it's in Barcelona. These kinds of discussion are going on of redesigning public space in a way. And for me, of course, Amsterdam is my city where I live. And behind Central Station, for example, there's this free space where it's actually quite difficult to get through.
Yeah.
When you're not fully able to run or walk or bike. So, but at the same time, if you are open enough, there are ways to go around that. So how do you look at that from your work, these kinds of topics?
Yeah, the more we talk about it, I think like it's the easiest is to first go towards the question of the road and the access and yes or no for light traffic and so on. But maybe it's more interesting to go deeper into even questioning what is public space. So yes, definitely in that case, it's impossible to cross that street. And I don't think that this order there is helping the city to be less rigid and unexpected. I think it's just super dangerous. So in that case, I feel like...
Yeah, but go to the other case. So
so I wonder if it's not only about what we see as public space, as obvious avenues and squares, but also spaces that are semi-public space or that are seen as non-public space, but what happens when they're seen as public space and then applied with these questions of disorder. So also bringing the inside, that is for me quite, that I find really intriguing to think about that, like disorder and the functions of spaces, changing functions of spaces within.
Yeah. So I've been reading now a very interesting book that I recommended. It's Palaces for the People by Erin
Yeah,
Klinenberg.
I read it.
And I think it's this concept of social infrastructure that Klinenberg talks about, that is those spaces for gathering at the end, for which form some kind of ecosystem of people and places that at the end they make cities much more resilient and much better. And this includes public spaces, but also includes the public libraries, community facilities, and so on. And a lot of the work that I've been doing with communities in London is about protecting those spaces, because those social infrastructure are not being they're not being valued by the financialized planning system, because they don't have
make money.
They don't have a short-term money, but in terms of welfare, they actually, I think, in the long term, they make huge saves of money to the health system. They're very positive for mental health, and so they don't make short-term money, but they have an incredible social value, and in the long term, they actually relieve a lot of the pressure of the care system in the country. Yeah.
So it's less about like this laissez-faire approach to public space, and it's more about connecting people and making sure that people can play in this public space. Liam,
if I can react on that, I think that is a very important point, and that if you bring it to the Netherlands, where all our designing processes are measured in Excel sheets, and where this social value is not added to that, that is one part. And also the question that was still on the table about comparing Barcelona and Amsterdam. I don't dare compare London. I only been there once. So, but what you in that rigid system of the Barcelona city, there's still enough space for adaptation. And if you look at the canals here in Amsterdam, also in the past centuries, it has shown that even though it's a rigid system, there's a lot of space for adaptation. There were no cars when it was designed, and it was used by cars, and now we are transforming it back again. The same counts for the buildings. But what we encounter nowadays in the Netherlands is with the beginning of the Bouwbesluit, which is the regulations in the 90s, where there is a minimum size for rooms, together with a Dutch culture that when you are doing something for the cheapest price, that is very good. You create space that only complies to the regulation and has no space for adaptation, or no space for what you have called the unpredictable, because it's designed for now and the function it has now. So I think, a book like this really gives space and to leave space for the unpredictable, because we don't know. Now we are doing with sustainability. I mean, if we build a building only to comply with the rules of today, it's not sustainable, because one thing is sure, that in 30, 50 years, we will have different requirements to our buildings.
Definitely, and I think in London, that resonates a lot to what's happening in London. We also have the kind of spreadsheet system in planning, where at the end it's kind of like the financial viability study, which is a big spreadsheet. It's what makes the project work or not, and it's also based on minimum kind of like the minimum amount for everything. And this is something that I experienced in these people's plans that I've been working with communities, which is basically they see that so it's mainly modernist housing estates, that the local authority wants to fully demolish them and rebuild something with a mixture of social housing and private housing. And these normally that leads to a lot of displacement of those communities that are kind of scattered around, sometimes more locally and sometimes less locally, depending on the local authority. But a lot of the new projects, they kind of like multiply the density by 3 or 4 times in many cases, and in most of the cases divide the community space by half or less than half, which means that there is like a tenth of only a tenth of the community space that it used to exist, and that's something that we've been experiencing. So that, for example, in the last people's plan that we were working on, one of the key places, okay, if we want to transform the housing estate, actually what residents want is more social and community infrastructure rather than increasing the density a lot. So we did kind of like a plan that included a bit of new homes here and there, but mainly a lot of more spaces to meet. Yeah.
So if we project this knowledge from the last 50 years, and of course you collected in this book, if we project it to the next 50 years, what kind of topics do we need to get out? I'm asking because to me we're in flux. It's a very strange time we're living through, with of course war on the European continent, also lots of a big crisis when it comes to climate change. There is a crisis with COVID. A lot of pretty much the government is broke, so we completely have to redesign how we're going to project for the future. And at the same time, we need to build lots of houses here, but I think also all over Europe, where there's a shortage of people. So there's a lot of things we have to take into account when we look to the future and project what kind of country or what kind of continent, what kind of city in that sense we would like to live in. So if you look at this book, what kind of ideas or lessons do we need to take along with this designing process?
Definitely. So I'm just going to take an anecdote which is related to this, which is that for the Chinese edition of the book, they asked me to write a preface.
Yeah.
Because the book came just before COVID. So the book was written before COVID.
Yeah.
It was published in April 2020, so it just at the very beginning of the lockdown. But then when the Chinese edition was going to come out, they were okay, why don't you write a preface updating the thing with COVID?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, do I want to do this?
It's a bit unfair.
And Richard told me, Pablo, if you do it with COVID, it'll be out of date in 5 years. Do it about climate change.
Yeah.
So I wrote kind of like a short preface, but I thought that it was quite interesting that actually a lot of the things that I would say about COVID, they're also the same things that I would say about climate change. So I'm just going to say maybe a few things, not to read the whole preface, but some of the things that I think that and it's something that comes also about the discussion that Richard and I have had when presenting the book elsewhere, is about that a lot of the discourses around cities that came out of COVID were about the 15-minute city and so on, this idea of the 15-minute city, which at the end of the day is exactly the same idea of the compact city that we think about. But this idea of the 15-minute city and the compact city doesn't actually look at the elephant in the room, which is the affordability of housing in the parts of the city that are compact and 15-minute wide, right? If we look at London, for example, a lot of people cannot afford to live next to their job. And that's the main reason why they commute 1 hour a day. That's the reason why the subway system is packed with people. And even if you put the most sustainable modes of transport in place, because of housing affordability, people are going to still have to commute hours a day.
Yeah.
Whereas if housing was much more affordable, and that needs to be regulated, people would have to commute much less to their houses. So I think that's something that definitely needs to be addressed in order to for sustainability. And then the other thing that I was talking more about, that it was around this issue around the social infrastructure, about these places to meet. Yeah. Because at the end, these spaces of social infrastructure, like the Granville Community Kitchen that I mentioned in the book, these are, and in the book I wrote it before all the work they did with COVID, they were an essential social infrastructure for the neighborhood before COVID. And then during COVID, they were the ones feeding those families at risk that could not afford.
But that's exactly the reason why I asked it, because to me, of course, during COVID, you had to have the social distance and you have to redesign cities in such a way. That's why perhaps lots of bike paths to all of you were put in. But afterwards, when we're looking at the whole situation right now, it's far more about inequality. and about lack of chances for certain people. So that's, and then of course there is the connection with climate change, and also with lack of access to energy, lack of access to food, and all these kinds of things. So you would say, so it is more about affordability of housing, it is more of affordability of services in your neighborhood.
But I think one is, so I think there's two different things. One is affordability of housing, and the other one is social infrastructure, which is spaces that enable people meeting and gathering, and that enable at the end these networks of solidarity that make cities much more resilient. And that's, for example, how Klinenberg's book starts. He starts talking about how in areas of natural disaster, in events of natural disaster, places where there were more social connections were much more resilient to those natural disasters, that people where people lived more isolated. So I think that's, I mean, that gives very clear reasons and directions for climate change, which is the big challenge that we're going to have in the next 50 years, definitely.
We're almost at the end of the hour, but I want to,
Really?
I'm sorry.
Goes
We can
Very
still
fast.
continue our talk later downstairs. And of course, when we close this part of the programming, of the broadcast itself, we can talk with the people here in the venue also. But I want to go to both of you for closing questions.
I had something lingering in my mind when reading the introduction of the book, and I think you've mentioned that here as well. The designing disorder as a way to enable people to deal with unexpected situations, and as a way to leave our bubble or meet the other. And I was quite curious, what is the relationship between that unexpected situation and the otherness? Where do these two interact in like one sentence?
I guess they're very similar, I guess. The otherness is... so the otherness relates more to situations, people, experiences that are not, let's say, that you're not used to, that you're not used to see. I mean, one clear example is that people have the ability of, but it also depends. The environment also plays a big difference, but through being more exposed to diversity, you become much more tolerant. So that's kind of like one of the many examples.
So it's the
And the unexpected situation is more is that as well, but it's also the kind of like unplanned activities and all the emergence of unplanned activities in public space.
Leonga,
Well,
final question?
Well, it's maybe a question, a comment. I think we have lost the connection with the humans, with whom we are designing for. And the moment you really go back to that, then you find disorder, or you find the space where something the unpredictable can happen. Because we as humans are actually very unpredictable in a sense, you know, and we need that. We need that space. So I think this is very important within the discussion on all the things that we have to do for climate change, but to keep the human and keep nature in mind, and how it functions or does not function sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. No, I completely agree. And I think that relates a lot to this idea of these spaces for the social connection and the human connection that are, I mean, they're key for addressing these small connections are key also for addressing big challenges.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you for this lovely discussion or dialogue about the future of our cities and creating disorder in our cities. Of course, your book, Designing Disorder, you can buy it right now. It's out.
Yeah.
What is your website? Where can people buy directly from you?
No, it's from the publisher, which is Verso. Verso.com.
Verso.com. So please go there. We put it on our website, of course. Also here in the Netherlands, there are lots of nice bookshops where you can probably buy it.
Sorry, it's Verso Books. Versabooks.com, I think.
Versa Books. We'll put the correct link on the website. But you can also go to a local bookstore to keep the social structure intact.
Exactly.
So, for example, here in Amsterdam, Scheltema or Atheneum, please do. Anyways, this was this special episode of Designing Cities for All. As I said, a project Pakhuis de Zwijger organizes together with the Dutch Creative Industry Fund, or Creative Industry Funds the Netherlands. We'll continue with a short after talk here in Pakhuis. If you want to join us next week or next time, please do look at the website dezwijger.nl for more information. All these programs are always free of charge. So please join us and join the discussion here in Pakhuis. And also, the next edition of Designing Cities for All will be on June 27th, and that will be on the Public Space Paradox. And also on dezwijger.nl, of course, all the other programs will be viewable. If you want to support us, please do. You're welcome to do so. You can become a member, or you can give a one-time support to us via the QR code that will be on the screen in a bit. Lots of thanks, of course, to Liunga Juliana, and of course to Shai Ravif. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining this discussion. And lots of thanks to you, Pablo Sandra.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
See you next time. Bye.